There are only two animals on the planet that the Creator identified himself with. The first one is the eagle, and the second animal is the lion. And I discovered that both of them are the kings of their domain. Now, what's the main thing that shocked me about the lion is that the lion is not larger than the giraffe, bigger than the elephant, or heavier than the hippo. He's not as smart as the hyena or the snake. And yet, when he shows up, they all run away.
So, new series on Daniel that is starting. And if you don't know, my name is John. I'm a pastor here, and I've been gone for a little while. And so, yeah, it's good to be back. So some of you are like, who's that guy? I do work here a lot, but I was gone. So anyways, I'm just glad that Zach and Anna both are just phenomenal speakers. So when I'm gone, I don't even worry about it. In fact, we got to watch Zach when I was over in Israel. That was kind of fun. And it's cool to see how things are working out. If you're watching online, it is certainly good to have you today watch, and I know that you're going to grow in your faith as well. So funny story. So we went, I'm not going to talk a lot about Israel now, but at points we're going to bring it up throughout the next year, 2 years, whatever. I'll show you some pictures. But before we were in Israel, we went down to Florida to help with the hurricane victims. And so we drove down there and brought a bunch of stuff with us. And one of the things that we drove my truck, and we also drove a 1993 Chevy van, or GMC van. Sean actually drove it. He's in the back there. Sean drove it down there. And so Vanessa, a friend of ours, just a good friend of ours for a long time, she gave us the van to drive down there and to bring back. So we successfully drove this 1993 van. Think how old that is. All the way down to Florida. I mean, it was cool. Except for Sean, he had no AC in it, so he was hot. But anyways, he made it down there. We unloaded everything. And on the way back, we lost fourth gear somewhere in Tennessee. And then we lost third gear somewhere in Missouri. And we're going 45 miles an hour down a freeway that you go 80. We're almost pulled over for being too slow. He's back there. He's like, well, I lost third gear now. So you only had second gear. And so we pull into a Holiday Inn in Chesterton, Missouri. Anyone ever been to Chesterton, Missouri? You have? It's a nice city. Nice city. So we went to Chesterton. And we abandoned this vehicle at the Holiday Inn. We took the plates off. I took everything out of it. And the plan was I was just going to call a junkyard and have them pick it up. We were going to put a transmission in at the Holiday Inn, but I had to leave for Israel like in the next day. So we had to be back for legitimate reasons. And Sean's a mechanic and he knows how to do all that stuff. So anyways, we called Vanessa and she goes, well, it's not worth anything anyway, so just leave it there. And then she posted online on a Facebook group. I didn't even know they had these groups, but they have Facebook groups where people who live in vans all have a Facebook group together. Who would have thought? And so she posted on there, free van in Chesterton, Missouri. Some guy in the state of Washington goes, I need a place to live. So he bought a plane ticket and flew to Chesterton, Missouri to live in the van in the Holiday Inn parking lot. You can't make that up. I just wish that I could someday know the rest of the story. You'll see him in a van down by the river, Craziness. Anyways, God, I thank you that we can be here today and study your word and learn from it. We know, God, that your word prevails. Your truth always prevails. We ask today that you'll be with us and that we will learn and grow closer to you in Jesus' name. Amen. How many of you have recently read the book of Daniel? No one? Okay. Well, we have a lot to learn then, don't we? So I want to encourage you throughout this series to actually read the book of Daniel, to get into it. And the first 7 chapters, you can be like, whoa, this is amazing, I understand it. And then you go the 7 through the end of the book, you can be like, I have no idea what they're talking about. Because it gets into some crazy, weird, apocalyptic, end time stuff, which is neat. There's really 2 themes in the whole book of Daniel. The first one is God's It's God's faithfulness during times of persecution. So when we're being persecuted, God is always faithful. God is always faithful. Even in the midst of persecution, God is faithful. And that's a theme in the book of Daniel. And you might think, is persecution really a thing? Well, it is actually now. We were just over in Israel. We were in Jordan and those places. And persecution is very real there. In fact, one of the nights I met with my friend, his name is Pastor Israel. He's from Israel. He runs he's the pastor of the second largest church in all of Israel. I spoke there last time we were there. And we met and had dinner together. He came and then he actually spoke to our group. And one of the things that he told us is that he is a pastor in Ashdod, that's a city. And in Ashdod, there are 400 Jewish synagogues and one church. One church. And the Orthodox Jewish people are not friendly towards evangelical Christianity. And they've been protesting his church so much so that he had to get a restraining order against him. You think building a building in Minnesota is difficult? For 7 years, they've been trying to move from the building they meet in to a warehouse shell next door. For 7 years, they've been fighting it. And finally, they're hoping to get approval this week to move into their new building to start working on it. And it's just a shell of a building. But he's faced all kinds of persecution. Persecution is real, and persecution is happening in our country. We're living in a day and age when we're seeing these things where everyone should be tolerant. We should be tolerant of everything except Christianity. Like we accept everything unless if you really follow Jesus, then we don't accept you. So we want to be loving except for in this area. And whether you call it woke or whether you call it some of these other different viewpoints that are being taught, it seems like Christians are the ones who are facing persecution. And I want to say that's not all bad because it really challenges us to think, are we living out our faith? Are you living out your faith? Do you really know what you stand for? Do you know why you believe what you believe? And if you do, are you willing to take a stand for it? And if you are willing to take a stand, at what point do you draw the line? Like when do you take a stand? Because everything shouldn't be a battle all of the time. You have to pick your battles wisely. At what point we say no more? And we're going to get into that because that's what Daniel did. And then the second theme of the book, let me back up for just a second. Let me give you a cultural example of someone who took a stand. Kanye West. I'm not an advocate of his, I'm not a fan. I'm just saying I want to make a stand because he made the news. He took a stand. He wore a shirt that said White Lives Matter. He's a black American. And he got blacklisted by a bunch of people in Hollywood, and a lot of his sponsors dropped him. He's also pro-life. And people dropped him. All these are the people that are supposed to be tolerant of this and that, and they dropped him because he took a stance. And he is like standing out as this hallmark in Hollywood. It's just interesting to see that happening and how that's flushing out. But that's persecution in real time for someone who actually has an opinion and takes a stand for it based on his own morals and ethics. Whether you agree with him or not, he took a stand and got blacklisted. It's called cancel culture, and it's been going on for centuries. In fact, you know why in ancient times, why all of the statues, they don't have any faces on them? People are like, why don't the old statues, is it weathered? Did the rain hit it and knock all their faces off? No. Whenever a country would take over another nation or a nation take over another nation, they would literally try to destroy the history by destroying all the statues and books of learning to annihilate the culture, and it was as if it wasn't ever there. It's even happening today. The second theme is apocalyptic and envisions Babylon's future and Israel's future with very symbolic literature. And if you read it, you're like, I don't even get this. Well, I got to be honest, it's hard for me to understand. I'm reading it, trying to interpret it, and you read different commentaries, and people have different opinions on it, and this vision of this and that and what's to come. It's confusing. I'm not going to necessarily steer into that. We're going to focus more on the courage aspect of Daniel than the apocalyptic side. But let me give you a little bit of a background here on Daniel, because in order to understand what we're talking about today and to apply it to your life, you need to know the context that the book was written. So Daniel was written in about 605 or 602 BC. That's before Christ. So today is 2022. That's 2,000 years and then 600 and whatever years. So you're talking, 2,700 years ago that this book was written, and it's still relevant to us today. So it was written by Daniel, who at the time when he was growing up and he describes these things, he was living in Jerusalem. He was a Hebrew teenager. And the Babylonians, what happened? Well, let me back up. The people who were living in Jerusalem, the Hebrew people, were God's people. And they were supposed to follow God's laws, the laws of Moses. And they were supposed to walk along these lines and obey the Torah and to live it out. And they got lazy. And they stopped doing that. You ever get lazy? Like you have good intentions? I know you do, because a whole bunch of you said, I'm going to the gym starting in January. How's that going for you? I'm not eating any more potato chips. Whatever. I was in Israel for 2 weeks. We didn't have bacon. First thing we ate when we got back, like 5 pounds of bacon. But they started well, and they had good intentions. And then they started to drift. They didn't really follow God anymore. They were started to drift and not follow God, and they were following other gods and other things and other ways. And you know what happened is they stepped out of God's blessing. God's blessing didn't move, they did. They didn't physically move, but spiritually they moved. They made so many compromises that they were no longer distinguishable from those around them. And when they stepped out of God's blessing, they stepped into trouble. And when they stepped into trouble, the Babylonians simply took over and they sieged Jerusalem. And when they sieged Jerusalem, it's called a brain drain. Like they took all of the talented people and enslaved them in Babylon. So now the Babylonians conquered it. And it was because God's people had chosen to not follow God's ways. They had drifted. And because they drifted out of God's protection and blessing, and now they were conquered by the Babylonians. And in doing so, there was profound ramifications for everyone involved. Everyone involved. See, for every action you take, there's always a reaction, right? So every reaction, there's a reaction. So if you do one thing, there's always consequences. For example, if you choose to speed on a regular basis or even whatever, you're breaking the law. And if you get caught, what happens? You have to pay the fine, right? And then your insurance company, I won't mention any names because we have insurance people here today, they jack your rates. Now, my insurance agent, who's here today, right? Hypothetically. If you treat your spouse poorly, there's consequences. If you treat your children poorly, there's consequences. If you overspend, there's consequences. If you lie, there's consequences. In the Israeli people, the Hebrew people, Jewish, it's all the same. I'm using all the same terminology here. When they stepped out of God's blessing, there were consequences. And those consequences had profound ramifications. They were conquered. They were enslaved. And now, life was not so good. Let's pick up in chapter 1, verses 1 through 4 in the book of Daniel. It says, the third year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. In other words, he took over the city. A siege is when they cut off all supplies. Think of it like a trade embargo. No food in, no food out, whatever. Eventually, they were starving, so they lost. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasure house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashphaz, chief of his court officials, to bring into the king's service some of the Israelites from the royal family and the nobility. What this means is they took the best and the brightest people and trained them to serve the Babylonian kings. It's called a brain drain. When the best and the brightest leave and what you're left with is derelicts and outcasts, the Babylonians knew this, so they took the best and the brightest. Young men without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. He was to teach them the language and literature of the Babylonians. So these 4 young men, specifically, we're going to get into a minute, these 4 young men are now the best and the brightest, and they are now captives in Babylon. They are enslaved. And this is what's to note. These young men were teenagers. Whenever we read the scriptures, we always imagine the person on the other end our age. So whatever age you are, that's how old you think Daniel is. If you're 20, you think Daniel's 20. If you're 80, you think Daniel's 80. These were 4 teenage boys. Teenagers. Like young. So if you're a teenager, or not even there yet, note this. You get to make a decision now on how you're going to live out your life. And never underestimate what God can do through you. With a willing heart and a desire to follow God, never underestimate what God can do in your life. Never underestimate that. Never. Here you see these 4 young men, teenagers, who are still making an impact on us today because they lived out their faith. They were faithful with what they had. And so they were to be trained for 3 years and then enter into the king's service. Think of it like college that they didn't really want to go to. They were forced into it to learn. And here's what's crazy, is they weren't just forced to learn college, like they weren't sent there to learn mathematics or this or that. They were learning astrology, divination, and magic stuff. This is all completely forbidden in the Torah. How is it that they could learn about these things and still be godly? How did they do that? Like, we talk about being in the world but not of the world. Daniel was in Babylon, but Babylon was not in Daniel. He was in the culture, but the culture wasn't in him. Because he had made decisions that he would honor God no matter where he was. So one of the first things that happened was their names were changed from Hebrew names to Babylonian names. Why? Because names are important. They were important. They are important. I don't know about you, but maybe you know that you were named what you were named for a certain reason. In either your mom or your dad, everyone has a mom, so and a dad. But do you know why you were named what you were named? For example, Josh, who's here now, we named Josh after the book of Joshua, to be strong and courageous. I could have said tall and courageous, that would have fit too. But strong and courageous. We named him Joshua, gave him my middle name because my middle name is my father's middle name. My father's middle name is my grandfather's middle name. So we just kind of did that. We wanted to carry that on. And Sarah, my daughter, we named Sarah after Sarah of the Bible because we wanted to have strong faith, be a strong woman. We gave the middle name Beth after my grandmother, who I admired greatly. And then my daughter Katie, we knew we weren't having any more children, so we named her after Kathy. And then we put in Charlotte Mary for this long middle name that doesn't fit in those little boxes anymore. But we named her after my mom and Kathy's mom because we wanted to honor them as well. So Katie, Charlotte, Mary, Braylon. So that's why we named our kids. And so some people today, we don't really think of why we give certain names to certain people. And I want to say I looked up some names and what they actually mean that are fairly common. It's like, oh. And I'm not going to share any examples in case if you're one of them. But I did look up some business names that you have to think, why in the world would you name a business this? It just doesn't make sense. I'll give you an example. Everyone knows Best Buy, right? You've heard of Best Buy, the company, Best Buy. So in Chinese, Best Buy is pronounced Besimai. I don't know, I don't speak Chinese. I'm probably totally messing that up, but that's Besimai. But what it means is this. If you say Best Buy in Chinese, this is what it translates to. It translates to this. Think it over 100 times before buying. Why would you name your company something that says, before you buy it, think it over 100 times? No. It should be like, buy it now, not think it over 100 times before buying. Or these are actual businesses. You can look them up. How about this business? Passmore Gas and Propane. It's in the town of Passmore. Like, you think someone like your uncle would do this at Thanksgiving for fun, right? But you wouldn't name your business this, but yes, they did. And here's another one, real business name. Check this out, funeral home out. Am I Gone Funeral Home? I'm sure it's their last name. But couldn't you have used your first name, like Joe's Funeral Home or something? Am I gone? Or how about this one? Dumas Taco. And in my original, I did not have that star in the picture because I thought it made a better point. Dumas Taco. You know what their motto is? Like their mascot? It's a donkey. Real business in Texas. Only in Texas can you have the name Dumas Taco and get away with it. And people go, that's normal. It's not normal. That's a crazy name. So the team's names were changed by the chief officer to basically eradicate their history, to get rid of where they were from, their Hebrew. They thought by renaming them, they would forget their own history. So they gave them new names. Verse 5, it says, the king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that they were to enter the king's service. Among those who were chosen were some from Judah, Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. The chief official gave them new names. To Daniel, the name Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, Shadrach, and to Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. So why is this important? Because their Hebrew names had significant meaning, and the new names they were given was a move to get them to absorb the culture and to live within that culture. So here's what their names mean. The Daniel's Hebrew name means God is my judge or vindicator, and he lived this out. God is my judge, vindicator. And the name it was changed to is Belteshazzar, and invokes the name of the king's god Bel. So he was named after a foreign god. Then you have the next one. Hananiah in Hebrew means Yahweh is gracious. And Shadrach, that his name was changed to, means companion of Aku. And Aku is a Babylonian god. And then you have Mishael. Mishael's name in Hebrew means who is like God. That's less of a question and more of a statement. Who is like God? In other words, there is no other. And Meshach was his new name. It refers to Aku, which is another Babylonian god. And Azariah, his name was changed, or his name was Yahweh is my help. And it was changed to Abednego, which means servant of Nebo, which is another Babylonian god. So he was named as a servant of a foreign god. The Babylonians had a ton of gods. I mean, they had a god, if you wanted it to rain, you worship one god. You wanted it to be sunny, you worshiped another god. If you're going to the beach, you'd worship another god. You wanted money, you'd worship another god. So they were worshiping like one god, another god, another. Whatever god would give them whatever they wanted, that's the god that they worshiped. And so there are tons of gods. And the Babylonians just had them all over the place. But Daniel and his friends had to decide where was the line that they were going to draw. Like at what point would they say, we are going to follow our God? Here's what's interesting, is that they were given different names. That's external. Daniel was raised up to be like a magician, a diviner, meaning he was to be able to interpret things. And these are pagan things. These would have been forbidden by God in the Babylonian culture. And yet he dressed like a magician. He was learned in the arts. And yet he didn't compromise his values. How do you do that? But when it came to worship, and when he was told to worship a different God, he said, no more. This is where he drew the line in the sand and said, I'm not going to cross this. See, what Daniel had was a good ethical framework. He knew who he was. He knew who he worshiped, and he had already established this ethical foundation in Jerusalem when he was a teenage boy. This is when he had made the decision that he had his ethical framework, that he would always do that which glorified God. He had made that decision already. This is important. He had made that decision already because it would come to be tested later. And now the Babylonians are saying you have a new name. It didn't bother them. It doesn't say anywhere in scriptures that they were questioning it. Then he says you have a new name, and then you also have a new job. They didn't question that either. When it came to setting the line where they drew it, is when they tried to get them from who they worship. They said, no more. We'll live in this culture, but we will not be of the culture. We will be different because of their ethical framework. Their ethical framework. In America, we were founded on Judeo-Christian ethics. That meant that everyone understood that everyone is responsible to a higher power. And it doesn't matter, all of us give account not just to the government, to a higher power. That's been our ethical framework from the beginning. But in the last decade or even more, it's been eroding. And nowadays, we don't even agree on the basic principles, regardless of your religion, if we give account to any higher power. And that's caused all kinds of division in our country. We're seeing political division. We're seeing division on all kinds of issues that we didn't even know were issues. And what this has really done is it's kind of wiped away the sand and allowed us to see our ethical framework underneath. In other words, do you know why you make the decisions you make? And do you know the consequences of the decisions that you make? And are you making your decisions based on a biblical framework or on a worldly framework? If anything, COVID exposed that we're not really as strong as Christians as we thought we were, because when there was pressure, we started to kind of crumble, and even the church got divided over different things that they shouldn't have really been divided over. See, the ground is level at the foot of the cross. So where do you take your stand? What ethical framework do you have? Most people unwittingly subscribe to this. It's an ethical system referred to as deontology. Deontologically. Let me read it here. Deontology. You ever get a word that you can't say? No matter how much you read it and said it? That would be this word. Deontology. And it's an ethical theory that many Christians adhere to. We didn't even know we refer to it, but philosophers love creating these little blocks and saying that this is how we live and this is what we believe. But basically, this theory means that in your mind, in your head, you make decisions and you say right, wrong, black, white, up, down. You have this framework in which you make decisions. And in our minds, we always want to make everything a black or white decision. Some people just want to say everything is black and white. And that works great until you come to a question that involves gray. And then how do you respond? I'll give you an example. In our culture, we're having all these gender questions when people don't know what is a woman or what is a man. And people are actually discussing this, which just blows my mind. And I don't understand. I think men should be rewarded for being men. When they're godly men, they should be rewarded for acting like a man. And a woman should be rewarded for acting like a godly woman. You just should. That's how life goes. But when you start to confuse that issue and people talk about it, all of a sudden Christians, we don't know how to posture ourselves or how to respond. And many believers have simply shut the door and said, I don't even want to talk to anyone who doesn't think like me or act like me. And my question is, how are you living out your faith if you won't even talk to other people? And how can we hate people up front and love Jesus? After all, Jesus hung out with sinners. You know who rejected Jesus? The Pharisees. The righteous religious people. Jesus hung out with sinners, tax collectors, the lowlifes. I mean, that was his crowd. And yet somehow their hearts were transformed by this gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ. And all of the apostles and all of the early believers, all of them had to develop this ethical framework, or how are we going to live our life in this complex society? And in Daniel's day and age, he had to do the same thing. How was he going to live out his life? What was he going to stand for in a culture that really didn't glorify his God at all? The way you respond to others, it really does reflect your ethic. It reflects your social ethic, if you want to frame it that way. Social ethics are really where the rubber hits the road in the public view. Everything that you believe is lived out in your social ethics. It's how you behave and how you respond to even things that we're addressing in modern culture. So if I ask you, what ethical framework do you adhere to? Most of us would say, I have no idea. I've never really thought of that. But what you believe always comes out under pressure. And for the last few years in society, we have been under pressure, and that pressure has really revealed what we truly believe and how we truly live our life. So do you know what you believe, and do you know why you believe the way you do, and do you have actions that are based on your beliefs? If they don't line up, why not? You need to be able to defend why you believe and why you behave the way you do. And if you're a believer, you need to have a good explanation for others. So in conclusion, let me just kind of wrap this up. And I know that I've talked about a lot of things, but this is what you need to do this week, is you need to make a decision before you have to make a decision on what you stand for or stand against or who you stand with. You have to make a decision before you make a decision. And I'm going to tie this back to Daniel, because before he was a Babylonian captive, he had made the decision to honor God no matter where he was. So it didn't matter if he was in Jerusalem, if he was in Babylon. It didn't make any difference. It didn't matter if he was digging a ditch or serving in an educational institution. He was going to glorify God. He had already made that decision as a teenager. Teens, this is important for you. Kids, young adults, make the decision before you have to make the decision. What are you going to stand for? Are you going to follow the teachings of Christ? And are you going to live that out in your life? Make that choice before you have to make the choice. Practically speaking, before you get into a relationship, make the decision now that you're not going to have sex before marriage. You're like, but none of my friends did, my parents didn't, grandparents didn't. You make the decision. It's up to you and you alone. You make that call. You make the call that you're not going to move in with someone until you get married. You make the decision before you have to make the decision. Make the decision that you're going to treat your spouse, if you're married, like a child of God before you get married. And even now, make that decision before you get in an argument. Because you will get in an argument. You want to be right or you want to be happy? I'm just saying. So you make the decision to treat your spouse like a child of God. You make that choice before there's pressure. So that when pressure comes, you've already made your ethical stance that you will treat them as a child of God before you have to make that decision. Make the decision now that you are not going to go into debt before you go into debt. Make the decision now that you're only going to spend so much on a car or so much on a house before you buy a car or a house. Because when you're faced with that new shiny thing, it's easy to talk yourself like, I could just get a third job. We could just pay. You make the decision beforehand. It makes it a lot easier in real time because you've already made the choice. You make the decision to raise your children in a godly way because those little terrorists are training. They're training to make your life miserable. But you've already made the decision. You're going to raise these kids. You're going to love them like Jesus loves them. You make the decision before you get super frustrated. You make the choice now. You make the choice to share your faith now so that when you're faced with a decision to share your faith, you've already chosen that you're going to talk about your faith before you have to do it. So you make that decision now. Make the decision before you have to make the decision. Daniel and these 3 other men, teenagers, made the decision to follow God before these big trials came their way. And we're going to cover that in the next few weeks. It took courage and it took boldness, and they did it. And you can too. Heavenly Father, help us to stay, to follow you. No matter what decision we have to make, may we always honor you. Whether it's at college, whether we're faced with an agenda or a theory that is completely counter and unbiblical, may we always stand for your glory, and may we build our ethical framework now based on your truth. And even in matters that are gray, we ask God that you will give us discernment to do the right thing at the right time. For your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.